Welcome to Inspiring Women with Laurie McGraw. I am your host, Laurie McGraw. I have spent the past 30 years in leadership, and over the years, I've come to learn one thing. Women need women, and not just any women, but inspiring women. Tune in every week to hear from women at the pinnacle of their careers and from others who are just starting out. Episodes can be found at inspiringwomen.show or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Thanks for listening, and I hope you will be inspired. This is Inspiring Women, and I am Laurie McGraw. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Brittany Barreto. She is a geneticist, and she has her PhD from Baylor College of Medicine, which she got about 5 years ago. And she's become quite the expert in the area of FemTech. She started FemTech Focus just a few years ago during the pandemic. She's sized the industry. She has a background in venture, startup. She's an entrepreneur. She's a podcast host and an expert in the field of FemTech. And Brittany, thank you for being on Inspiring Women.
Thank you so much. I didn't realize my PhD was 5 years ago. So thanks for counting that out for me.
It's been a long time, right? You've had got a lot done in just 5 years. It's kind of impressive, which I'm looking forward to talking to you about.
Absolutely, yes.
All right. So Brittany, let's just dive in. I always start inspiring women, just getting a sort of state of play of what do you do right now? What does your day-to-day look like with FemTech Focus?
Yeah, FemTech Focus, our two main missions are to one, raise awareness for the need for sex-specific healthcare innovation, and two, support the founders innovating in this space. And so we do that through four specific ways. The first is a podcast. So if you're listening to this podcast, you may like mine. It's called FemTech Focus on all your streaming devices. So that's one way that we raise awareness and give exposure to founders. Two, we have a virtual community. So again, you can go to femtechfocus.org, join our community. We have about 2,000 femtech founders in there and different people looking for work in femtech, or interns and students, or even professionals who want to give back or advise. Three, we do events. So we have an annual summit and also like one-off events that are for whatever the industry needs. So this year I realized there was a lot of open positions and a lot of people switching industries, mostly women. So we held the jobs fair with over like 500 candidates and 90 open positions. And then last but not least, my favorite part actually is market research. So I believe that if we don't measure it, we can't improve it. And so, when I first started getting into femtech 3 years ago, I could not find a list of startups, which seemed to be the most basic ask you could have for an industry of like, who's in the space? And that didn't exist. And so today, FemTech Focus is probably most known for our reports that we put out on, quantifying how large the market is, what are the trends, who's exiting, how much money's being, returned to investors, because all of that will, essentially result in more investment in the industry. So most of my day is spent talking to founders, chatting with people in our community, interviewing folks for the podcast, organizing events. And my favorite part is working in Google Sheets and making some cool graphs, seeing the trends of women's health.
Sounds quite busy. I want to sort of, before I talk about the state of play in femtech, because that industry is, there's a lot happening there, and it's really just wonderful how you're helping to shape, promote, and advance, particularly women in that area. But before we get to that, Brittany, just give us a little bit of the bio sketch. Like, how did you get here? So from, it's only been a couple of years from the PhD, but, how did you decide to get into this field, and then what brought you to startups and entrepreneurship and this type of work?
Yeah. Well, I became obsessed with DNA actually in high school, which I realize I'm like a blessed person to have found something really that sparked me academically as a teenager. And I just love this idea of, who we are is encoded in our genome. And so went to college, majored in biology, pursued a PhD in genetics. But honestly, even in college, but then especially in PhD, when I was in the laboratory, I just didn't feel this sense of like, oh, this is where I'm going to be for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. I actually really struggled to make friends. I'm very extroverted. I'm very like loud and colorful and boisterous. And so like that usually doesn't fit really well in a sterile lab environment where there's predominantly introverts. And I love my science community. I love my science friends, but I just didn't feel like I was thriving. And so I started to look for alternative career routes for graduate students. And I went and toured a startup one day, and they were drinking beer, eating pizza, and they were wearing jeans. And I was like, this could be where I
This
end up.
is me.
This feels a little bit more like home. So I started my first startup called Pheromore. It was the world's first DNA-based dating app. So I matched singles based on DNA. That was a really fun adventure. You can Google that, learn more about it. But that was how I essentially got into startups. Unfortunately, that company closed due to various number of reasons. I'd be happy to send you the news article, put in the show notes or something, but closed that company. And I used that as a launch pad to get into venture capital, because that's where I saw the power really is. It's who's deciding who gets the money. And so became a venture capitalist, worked at a fund in Texas, and I started to mentor a few FemTech companies. And that's when I got the FemTech bug.
Well, there is a lot of power in where the money flows and who it comes from and how it comes from. So I want to talk about particularly women and venture, and really appreciate your advocacy in that area in addition to your work there. But let's start with just the state of play in femtech. So you've described this industry as a $1.1 trillion industry when you sized it. So what is going on there? What is happening today? And how did it become such a passionate interest for you to focus exclusively in femtech?
Yeah, well, femtech really should be just health tech, but something happened along the way in medicine. Females and women have historically and systemically been excluded from medicine. We've been seen as too complicated, too high risk. This idea of, our sole purpose in life is to have babies, and being in clinical trials could potentially divert that life goal of women. Obviously, I'm speaking from a kind of a sad voice. That's the backdrop of healthcare, but that's what it was. And so what has happened is that, whether it be drugs, medical devices, diagnostic tools, billing codes, even just the healthcare system flow, like how the systems work, it's based off of 190-pound white male health. And so women, it results in us having 5 times more side effects from therapeutic drugs. It results in 72% of FDA approved drugs have zero data on pregnant or breastfeeding women. And what does that look like? It looks like women for years of their life unable to take medication because nothing's been tested for her. Because women aren't pregnant for the weekend, obviously, right? Like we're either trying to be or are breastfeeding for years at a time. And so we really need to create healthcare solutions specifically for the female, women, and girl population. So that's kind of the backdrop as to how femtech even needed to be a term. My hope is that one day we can just go back to health tech, but until half of the booths at, health conferences are about the uterus, I don't think we'll be there anytime soon.
But the funding landscape has changed a bit. So again, in this pretty large industry, we've seen just from PitchBook data that we've gone from about $600 million of funding in this area to almost $2 billion in the past couple of years. So do you think that the funding landscape for femtech, and let's call it femtech because that's what it is for now at least, and I think your descriptions are pretty apt in terms of the underinvestment over many years prior to, but based on the increases that we've seen, do you still think we're underfunded? Do you think that in this area, do you think more is needed? What are you seeing there?
100% more is needed. I think the increase in investment happening right now is because of the increase in number of deals to be funded. So we see a direct correlation with the number of women in STEM and the number of solutions for women's health growing. The vast majority of femtech founders are female. It's not a requirement. It's just how it ends up being. And so we are seeing a huge boom in solutions. So therefore the investment is following that boom. And then I would say that one of the key reasons that femtech is finally really being talked about and discussed and becoming mainstream is COVID finally revealed to us that, not everyone gets the same healthcare based on your race, based on your zip code. And now we just add in based on your gender and sex. And people have, seen from the pandemic, like, oh yeah, I've heard about this healthcare disparity thing. And so it kind of was, our entryway to get into the conversation to say women don't get the same healthcare either. And that's why we need these solutions.
So what types of solutions are you looking at? What are some of the exciting companies that you're working with?
Ooh, it's so great. So one of the things that I've done is I'm tracking 1,100 femtech startups, and each company is tagged with a product type and femtech vertical because it is actually so broad. So there's 18 different product types. So it ranges from medical devices, diagnostics, consumer product goods, digital health apps, therapeutic drugs. So those are the products. And then femtech vertical. So you have your typical bikini medicine, which is, breast health, uterine health, fertility, maternal health. But now we're also starting to see companies focus on things that disproportionately or differently affect women, like heart disease and bone health.
A bikini medicine is a new term for me. I don't know if that's a particular specialty, but I like that one. Hey, so Brittany, let's talk about Dobbs. Okay, so obviously an enormous landscape change for women that is not just health; it's everything. It's economics. It's rights. It's deeply personal for so many and men as well. What's the impact on the tech industry, your startups, and what you're seeing change because of Dobbs?
Yeah. Well, we already only had about 2 companies in the world innovating on abortion. So we already really didn't have a lot of solutions. And that was because even before Dobbs, investors were really afraid to touch that. And also like just startups, it's so high risk. So to go into something that, on a state by state ruling, you just it's such a hazardous topic to try to innovate in, but yet at the same time, so critical, absolutely needed. And so first of all, I think that there's this perception of all these abortion startups, like no longer were able to operate, but in fact, there was only 2 to begin with. Where I actually see the change in energy or change in momentum is in the fertility and contraception space, because the overturning of Dobbs and the rules that are now, state by state coming out are honestly biologically incorrect, right? So they're saying things like life begins at fertilization, which is in the fallopian tube, which then makes all IUDs essentially, like illegal. And so we're actually seeing a lot more concern in our community with, IUDs and other types of contraception that may stop a fertilized egg from implanting in the uterus. We see concern in the IVF world with moving eggs and sperm and embryos across state lines, and how many are you allowed to harvest? If an embryo is considered life, does it deserve to be born, and who's going to birth it? And so that's really where we're seeing those concerns. And then last but not least, obviously the privacy policy business, because you can kind of figure out if someone's pregnant based on what they're monitoring in their app. And unfortunately, the way the government is set up, they're putting this stuff under the category of murder. And so even if we have the best privacy policies, companies may still be forced to hand over data that they have from their users.
Well, I think there's, obviously there's a lot of very, very polarizing issues that you're talking about. And it strikes me, Brittany, that the opportunity for you with FemTech Focus to just put some education out there about,
Yes.
some of these impacts based on your community of thousands of founders and entrepreneurs in this area could just be helpful. And it's a challenging time to say the least, but solutions are going to be required. So thank you for the focus on that. Let's talk about women in venture. Let's just, we know the numbers where just women startups, women founded, led businesses are generally just receiving far less of the financial resources. So while there is tremendous amount of investments going into startups, they are not going to female founders. Less than 2% or about 2% of venture money is going to the female founders. What are you seeing? And is it changing based on the landscape in FemTech?
Yeah, it is changing for us in terms of if you've been able to build a product and prove out some traction, because our solutions are so needed, usually traction, if you do have a good solution, is quick to obtain. Women are desperate for solutions for their menopause symptoms or, their endometriosis cramps. And so we do see pretty successful funding after a Series A. So like more than $5 million. But again, that's kind of like you've proven it out. Where we're really, really lacking is that seed stage, early stage. I have an idea or an MVP or some early, traction. That's really where we're seeing the huge like gap in funding. And I would say that that's twofold because, investing, you have to consider numbers, financials, and you have to consider your own personal passion for the project. And unfortunately, the predominant gender that is the investment decision maker is male. And so one are lacking the financials for FemTech. And that's one of the things that I'm working on is publishing more and more about the market size, publishing about exits that have happened, how many big returns have happened, how much people got back, because that will hopefully influence these investors to say, oh, look at all this history of other people making money. I should put my money into this too. And then secondly, we just need to get people excited about, things like heavy menstrual bleeding, urinary incontinence, breastfeeding. And, I think we can turn men into big advocates and people who are really excited about these topics. But I think the easier route is just to get more female investors because they'll know it right from the get-go.
Okay. And so there are, several of these, funds. So there's Serena Ventures, there's Coyote Ventures, which you co-founded to, begin these conversations. And I'm assuming, you tell me, Brittany, but I'm assuming that the FemTech Focus community that you talk about there's a lot of resources available for early stage companies, female founders to figure out some of these issues they need to navigate. Is that right?
Yes, but there's one thing to like give people advice. And I think there's another thing to cut people checks. And I think women in entrepreneurship have experienced this for many decades, right? We have all these like mentors, but we have limited investors. So I am a big advocate for like, we don't need any more panels. We don't need any more office hours. We need checks.
Okay. All right. We need checks. All right. That sounds like a really great title for this episode. And I appreciate that really great advice. Brittany, let's come back to you. So as as a scientist, as an entrepreneur, as a CEO, when you started out as a young entrepreneur, I consider you still fairly young, even though you're pretty active and have done a lot in the past several years. How has the pandemic shaped your career outlook? Has it changed in terms of what you wanted to be when you grew up, or is that changing every single day?
Yeah, the pandemic actually kickstarted this career because March 2020 is when I started the podcast. And I jokingly say I started it because quarantine does not look cute on me. Like I'm such an extroverted, personable person. So being in my studio apartment in Houston for 30 days at a time, it was like, I can't take it. And so the podcast actually was born out of me trying to reach out through my computer and meet other people. So I would say the pandemic had an absolutely huge pivotal effect on my career. And I'll probably never go to an office again. High heels have really taken a back seat in my closet. But I really do love the virtual first work environment, specifically for the women's health industry, because so many of our founders are female and a lot of them are moms. And so you do not see a hub for FemTech. There's no like one city that's known for it. It's very global. We have listeners in over 125 countries. Podcast, friends I have, they're like, whoa, you have people just outside of North America. I'm like, yeah, Africa, South America. Only where I'm missing is Antarctica. So if any of y'all are in Antarctica, please check out FemTech Focus. But I think it speaks to it's, if we want to cater to this industry, we need to think about these are moms trying to live in, family friendly communities, and they're likely taking care of their families because they're women. And so this isn't going to be something where we have this center of gravity in Los Angeles or Boston or like these big, major, expensive cities. Instead, I think FemTech will continue to live on Zoom, essentially.
Okay, well, global is good because half the resources across the globe are women. So really
Yeah.
appreciate that. As we sort of close out here, Brittany, I'd love to get your perspective on where does FemTech go in 5 years? What's your optimistic vision for where we might be 5 to 10 years out?
Oh my gosh, we're going to have so many big exits, like billion-dollar exits. And we've already had 5 in the last 30 years. And there's a bunch that are worth $1 billion, but haven't exited yet. So I think we're going to have a lot of big exits. I think that we're going to start to see new versions of Procter and Gamble. And what I mean by that is there's been so few companies focused on, for example, feminine care aisle, that they've almost become monopolies, and we need new leaders that are acquiring a portfolio of products. And so I think we're going to see some new major names born in the next 5 years that, we look back in 20 years from now and say, yeah, wow, that's when they actually really became the it company. And I think that, FemTech will continue to become mainstream. People won't ask me anymore if I'm saying fintech. And I hope that we can get more men involved, because unfortunately, one of the things I'm most discouraged by is the lack of men that attend FemTech events. They think like, oh, that's like a girl's thing. But what I'm encouraged to see is that the FemTech community is so collaborative, is so passionate. The Northern Star is improving women's health. And with those kind of value sets and that shared success business model, we're going to be wildly successful. So it's going to be a great industry. So come join us.
Okay, well, your energy and passion, it all starts with education to bring in others. And the way that you talk about it is certainly inviting and exciting. So Brittany, we're closing out here on this great conversation. I so appreciate it. Last question for you. Any advice for listeners, younger women who are starting out in their career, just based on your own professional experience?
Walk around the world and ask yourself, was sex considered when they made this? Even if it's your seatbelt in the car, to date, there is still no regulations requiring female test dummies for car safety. And so I venture to say most of our lives are actually created with the male paradigm. And the more people we have walking around asking, was this made with me in mind or somebody else? They will then be the person to say, I don't think so. And I think I can make a better version. And I cannot wait to see all the better versions of products around the world coming out.
That is an awesome perspective, Brittany. I have really appreciated this conversation. I've learned a lot, actually. So thank you so much. This has been an episode of Inspiring Women. I've been speaking with Brittany Barreto. And Brittany, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been an episode of Inspiring Women with Laurie McGraw. Please subscribe, rate, and review. We are produced by Kate Cruz at Executive Podcast Solutions. More episodes can be found on inspiringwomen.show. I am Laurie McGraw, and thank you for listening.